Hi, everyone, and welcome to GLF Live. I'm Gabrielle Lipton, the editor of Landscape News for the Global Landscapes Forum, and today we're here with Joshua Pribanic to discuss a very interesting and timely topic, the rights of nature. In brief, the rights of nature is the ideology that functioning ecosystems should not be viewed as property under the eyes of the law, but rather as living entities just like people that have the legal right to exist and persist. And this can have a major impact on conservation because it means that if these rights are violated, people can enforce these rights by claiming nature as an injured party. So this is the topic of Joshua's documentary, Invisible Hand, which Joshua co-directed and released last year to much acclaim. It's won numerous awards, and it looks at how local communities have defended the rights of nature against major corporations in the US, and how this connects to the global rights of nature movement, as rights of nature now exist in 17 countries around the world. It's a gorgeous and it's a deeply affecting film, and I encourage everyone to watch it. And it's also the product of years of Joshua examining this topic through his time as editor-in-chief of the Public Herald, a newspaper that played a pivotal role in legalizing nature's rights to defend against fracking waste in parts of the US. So Joshua, thank you so much for joining us today, and congratulations on such a beautiful film. I would just like to dive right in. In your own words, could you describe how giving rights to nature works within a legal system?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Gabrielle, and thanks for all of your good comments about the film too. Appreciate that. Rights of nature is essentially to simplify it, it's basically you're giving nature personhood so it has legal standing in court. You know, in the Western structure of law, the way that you get things done is you have legal standing and you file lawsuits, and that's how you move forward. Unfortunately, we've been working on a system of regulations for the last 30 or 40 years, and that has not given representation to nature in court. This is a completely different version of where you're going to go in the future with democracy and with legal frameworks by giving nature a voice and allowing it to represent itself in court the same way as these corporations have for so long. And I am coming from the occupied lands of Ennis, Montana, which is right around the Madison River Valley and Pine Creek Reservation and other nations that have occupied this territory. And it is home to Yellowstone. So I'm right outside Yellowstone filming for our next film as well. Been one of the most diverse ecosystems in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for joining us from the road today and from your mobile office. And look forward to hearing more about what's in store for your next film. But to go back to the film you just produced, Invisible Hand, one of its main focuses is on the local communities that are driving the rights of nature forward and defending nature on its behalf. So could you talk about the role of local communities in the rights of nature movement and how sometimes they're more powerful than state and national governments in defending ecosystems?
Sure. Yeah, the local communities that were kicked off much of the movement for rights of nature across the world, and they still are, trailblazing where that's going to go. And in the film, you see, a focus on 4 communities in particular, where we also reference ones internationally that have done things, and how they have battled to establish rights of nature or establish these principles in their own front lines. But they have basically, rewritten what their local laws are going to be to include rights of nature. So therefore, their ecosystem has standing in the court, be that a river, a heritage food source, or the air, or the soil. So there's a lot of different ways that communities are trying to represent their ecosystem, trying to represent nature in their area, and that has moved up to, hasn't trickled down, it's moved up to the state and national governance. So you have countries like Ecuador and Bolivia who were passing rights of nature amendments in their constitution. You have places in the United States who are communities that are trying to amend their state constitution, which the group in the film is working to amend the state constitution. The other group cited in the film in Florida is working to amend their state constitution, and other people are as well, to put rights of nature in that language. So the ultimate goal, of course, is to change the federal constitution and amend it so therefore it included rights of nature.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And that is one of the most powerful parts of the film, is seeing these small communities really stand up and have their actions make a difference in national legislation. But if legal recognition of nature's rights is achieved, is it strong enough to prevent corporations from still causing harm? Or after rights of nature are indoctrinated, what risks still remain?
Yeah, I do think it's strong enough to prevent corporations from causing harm. For instance, in the film, Grand Township has kept out that corporation from building in its community for the last 7 years now. Any other community that's tried to play the zoning and ordinance route or traditional regulation route has really never had that kind of success with as much pressure as somebody like Grand has been getting in lawsuits and attention from the state, attention from all different levels, and still able to keep these corporations out of their community. And most of all, I mean, this is about a belief system, not just a tactic, a legal tactic to use in your area. This is about fundamentally shifting the way of thinking in society so that nature is put at the center of decision making rather than humankind. So you're moving from an anthropocentric society with capitalism and democracy to an anthropocentric society, to an ecocentric society, which is going to look much different than where we've been, for the last couple hundred years. We haven't never really had a chance to put nature at the center of decision making, and we're essentially getting back and honoring a lot of the indigenous legacies who have cultures and have nations that represent nature in their language and at the core of their thinking. And we're hopefully going to be moving in that direction. And that's the most powerful thing, is the ideological shift. Not so much what's going to happen in the courtroom, but what's going to happen in the minds and in people's actions throughout the world from here on out.
Mm-hmm. It is indeed a different way of looking at the world, and a much more values-driven one, and ethical way of looking at how we live in our society today. And we will get back to that later in the conversation. I have some questions for you about that part of the film as well. But I wanted to quickly go back to something you mentioned before, which is water sources. And in the US, as well as other countries, water sources have been a big focus of the rights of nature movement, and creating rights of nature in and around water sources that risk contamination from what corporations are doing with their waste and whatnot. Could you speak a bit about why water sources have been such a focus so far?
Well, everybody has their thoughts on that. I think that, if you're looking at it from, I guess, a journalist perspective, the water source is the first thing that's going to have the most impact in the area. It's usually where the contamination is going to start. It's different in other places. I mean, you do have, like the Maldives that we cite in the film, where their biggest risk is, of course, the climate crisis, wiping out their way of living. Or you have other places that might have air issues in particular. But in most cases, it's the water that's first impacted by whatever the projects are that corporations are starting, that are really spawning a lot of the rights of nature actions and causing people to think differently. The other big thing that we see is that water reaches across the table and cuts through party lines. So you don't have a situation where, Democrats and Republicans are fighting against each other on this issue. They all want clean drinking water, and they're willing to come together to establish that. And right now in states, the people who have the most environmental protection for nature in their community are the ones that are conservative that you see in the film are traditionally a conservative area. So water is the reason that that happened, and that is what united all different fronts to get those bills passed.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
And then circling back to what we were just talking about before that question, the film makes the point that giving rights to nature is a moral and ethical decision in addition to just being logical, like keeping water sources clean from radioactive fracking waste. Could you speak a bit more about the values driving this movement, and especially the impact that that's had on you as you've been entrenched in this movement for so long? How have you felt the power of this more ethical, values-driven approach to how we view the world?
Yeah, it's amazing to see it happen. I think that the way people speak about nature and the way that their relationship has evolved with nature through rights of nature has been some of the most dramatic shifts that I've seen. You know, folks who had nothing to say about water, for instance, and clean water before, and then all of a sudden they could speak for nature in ways that they never thought that they could. And that's opening a door that nobody's had to really open before. You know, when they've reflected on who they are and reflected on what they're doing, and then all of a sudden they think, now I have to talk on behalf of nature, and I have to be here for nature, for kin. And when that happens, you just see an entirely new narrative develop in real time. So you're filming an entirely new historical narrative happening in real time that we've never seen discussed before. And I think that's what's been like just shocking for me. I've been involved in the rights of nature movement since 2006, and I never thought I'd have a chance to film it this soon. I thought, you know, years down the road, maybe. But being able to film it now, I think some of the most radical shifts for me have been how I've seen the concept, how I've seen the idea in relation to other ideas in our culture. And I think that rights of nature, instead of it being like this competitive and combative system that is going up against capitalism, I just see it as like the natural evolution outside of capitalism. That capitalism essentially has created its own Achilles heel. It's inevitable. And this is where we are going to go moving forward. And that kind of value system is unwritten. We don't know where that's going to be or what that's going to do to us or what that's going to do to our culture, what it's going to do to our government. It may entirely change our government. And I'm very excited to see what the possibilities are, you know, going forward, because this is what we need. You know, we really need to change our minds and our approach to nature, and stop talking about jobs and start talking about, you know, how to protect the water, how to protect the air, and making sure that we have industry that does that successfully. And I can't wait to see what happens once we get going in that direction.
Thank you. I love your optimism. It's so inspiring. And it is the way forward. But as you mentioned earlier on, it's also bringing up from the past the ways Indigenous and traditional communities have long viewed nature as the center of everything. So I imagine it's a bit of modernizing some of those old belief systems that worked for so long and putting them into our context. Something that I just heard you mention in your last answer was referring to nature as kin, and you've chosen to go by the pronoun he and kin. Could you explain this pronoun choice to listeners who are unfamiliar, and also speak about your decision to make this change?
Yeah, I've always been uncomfortable with gender pronouns in particular. I've usually gone as non-binary with no real particular preference. And Kikin came when I was introduced to, you know, ideas from the Anishinaabe and Ojibwe languages, and other languages, of course, that were cited in Braiding Sweetgrass, where they talk about referring to nature and nature's pronoun as he, kin, rather than it or something else like that. And of course, this is a universal gender that unifies all of us. So all of us individually and with nature can share that symbiotic declaration of he, kin. And I feel that for myself, if I'm really honoring putting nature at the center of decision making, and I'm taking myself out of that, and I'm stopping, my own focus on myself and my ego, then I would be referred to as he, kin in those instances. So, this is just one small thing that people can do, but it's a way for us to always constantly be understanding that connection we have to nature, and that connection we have, to this river, to these trees, and to this life that's around us. So I go by that for that, to honor that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, language does shape so much of how we view the world and how we see the world. You're also writing a book about a concept that you've developed called Humanitocracy. Can you tell us a bit more about this concept?
I will. My mobile office is shut down, so I'm waiting for it to turn back on. Sorry about that.
We can still hear you very clearly, so
okay, great.
No problem.
Could you repeat the question for me, Gabrielle?
Sure. It was asking you about the book that you're writing about the concept of Humanitocracy. Could you tell us a bit more about this concept?
Yes. So, yeah, it's a concept that I've developed for a few years now, and I haven't actually talked about. But I've been having so many crazy health issues since COVID. I figure I better start sharing these thoughts about what this new government would look like. It's right along the lines of rights of nature being an evolution outside of capitalism. I think that with that, there's naturally an evolution that's going to happen with democracy. That democracy is a very anthropocentric system. It is one that focuses on man in particular and on humankind. I think that our government going forward will have to be one that does put nature at the center and does focus on nature rather than man in particular. And that's how decisions get made. And my co-director, Melissa Troutman, in the film, often talks about this as living within the laws of nature. That we've gone beyond that, and we have not respected the laws of nature, and that's what's put us in this crisis that we're in right now. So it is getting back to that kind of structure. Natocracy means, nat being birth in Latin, and this kind of connection to government. So it's the idea of rebirthing government, making a government that's for all life in particular, not just human life, and moving forward in the world. I don't want to feel like, this is some kind of communism or socialism where it's trying to defeat democracy in order to have the pedestal. I feel like democracy can still exist in some way, shape, or form where you do vote for and approve elected leaders that then go out and represent the laws of nature and represent rights of nature and those things, rather than simply representing what they do now, which is just our constitutional freedoms, which are simply not enough to protect the life around us and to keep us alive in general. I think that all that needs to be kind of reconsidered and will be reconsidered eventually. And the good thing is that I think it will move us into a natocracy or something else. I don't know what it'll be. I don't believe in owning terms or owning anything. I feel like, we're all part of this landscape of knowledge, and we just sort of find things and share them, but they're not really ours. And whatever kind of government structure that is that gets shared for the future, natocracy is just my word and my way of representing that and writing about it, to get to a place where the power shifts from man to nature, and we have a governance finally after thousands of years that puts nature at the center of how we make our decisions.
Mm-hmm. It's a great concept, and it's nice to have a single word to pin to it, because I think this is a topic that's come up so much since COVID, when recognition has started to spread that destroying our ecosystems, it really harms us, and it harms our families, it harms our health, it harms the things directly impacting us. So hopefully having more words and more vocabulary to help accelerate this shift, it will help, and it will be so important. So I look forward to reading your book. As we're nearing the end of our conversation, I want to broaden it out a little bit. So the film focuses on the rights of nature movement in the US, but the movement also spreads globally, and the film touches upon that. But rights of nature are recognized in New Zealand, in Colombia, in Bolivia, Ecuador, India, a lot of other countries. How are you seeing the movement take hold around the world? Excuse me. And how are you seeing communities around the world who are involved in the movement support one another, connect with one another, build this movement together?
Well, I feel like it's growing like wildfire right now. There are so many organizations that are working on this, and we do have them listed on the website. So if you go to invisiblehandfilm.com/action, there'll be a list of organizations there. Or if you go to What Are Rights in Nature at the top of our page, click that, there'll be another list of organizations there. And all of them are doing work internationally to help mobilize rights of nature initiatives and amalgamate this movement on a global scale. And you can see things that have, that are dramatically changing and getting people to think differently about corporations like Ecocide, for instance. Polly Higgins started Ecocide in reflection on rights of nature. The idea that if we had rights of nature, wouldn't we then have a different criminal system that existed? And so, her concept of Ecocide then was born out of that, and it ended up talking about how we can criminalize these acts by corporations that are intentionally or in some way doing harm to the environment on a mass scale, or in a way that is destructive, and we can then hold them accountable in the courts through Ecocide and prosecute them that way, same way as we would prosecute somebody for taking life in another form on this planet. So those are dramatic and important changes that have to happen, that are now happening globally. I mean, we last year we didn't have this option to prosecute corporations through something like that. Now we are moving down that path, and the same is true for the communities who are working on these initiatives in New Zealand, and the ones in South America. And the ones in South America, are some of the most important in the world. They're just taking this to a whole other level by defending, entire forest systems down there, or entire river bodies and doing it successfully. They've been keeping projects held off in many instances, whether they be logging projects or dams, through rights of nature. And that has inspired the world. That has inspired people to take this on and bring it into their local communities. And they're learning from these amazing people in countries outside of the United States, for instance, that are providing a platform for everybody else to stand on so they can do this stuff locally. So as more and more of these platforms have been developed by local communities and by others, it's just allowing more and more people to stand on that and say, I would like to establish this locally. I would like to establish this for our government. And what you're finding is that as far as the environmental movement goes, and that is where most people want to go in these instances. Going back and saying, well, I don't think rights of nature is the way to go, and I would rather stick with regulations and appeal permits and work in the court system that way. I think, thankfully, our generation has found out that that's a fallacy, and that is a system that has been designed and controlled by capitalism, by these colonial governments, and we need to break that system, and we need to move into something else. And that's where rights of nature comes into play. And I feel like that is where the momentum is. That is where the inspiration is. That's where people are building new fires. And I'm hopeful that more partnerships, more cooperation, more symbiotic relationships happen with these fights globally. And the film is kind of a precipice for that. So Invisible Hand is a way for you to get connected to the issues that are happening on rights of nature, and for you to reach out. There are great groups out there. There's CELDF, who's in the film. There's GARN, who we've done a lot of work with. There's the Earth Law Center. And like I said, there's a whole list of them on our website, and anybody should reach out and connect with them and see what's possible.
Thank you. And it is a film that has action points involved, which is one of the most powerful parts, is you do walk away feeling like this is something that you can have a hand in and take action on. So once again, I encourage everyone to watch the film if you haven't already. And then I'll end on a personal note. In your relationship with the rights of nature movement, and in the years that you've spent reporting on it, filming communities working on it, what have you learned most that you hope to teach other people?
We've got a lot of traffic around here today.
No problem.
This is a busy library parking lot. I feel like for me, again, what I've learned most is to stop this obsessive compulsive reaction we have in our world for individualism. To quit coming at these ideas and these issues through your own self-interest and your own kind of selfish desires that you might have, or thoughts that you might have, and instead try and ask nature what it needs in those circumstances, or what you can do for nature in those circumstances, and then find an answer that way. And I think that for me, like, that lesson of basically trying to dissolve the ego and to dissolve that self-interest and move into another kind of identity has been the most important lesson for me to learn. It's for me to not feel like that like I'm somehow the center of whatever that particular issue is, and that's how I have to approach this, through my own individual responsibilities and that kind of thing, which is what the mainstream culture wants us to think, right? I mean, they want us to buy better lights, and it's your responsibility to do this and to do that, and not really ask yourself, like, what is it that you can do for nature overall? Should you be working to try and remove that corporation from society and replace it with a different one? And that's probably where most of our thinking would go if we were asking the environment what needs to be done, because those things that we buy doesn't mean that the environment is safe. It might mean that it looks like the environment's safe because we're reducing our energy consumption in certain instances. But what's the external cost of manufacturing those things? What's been done to the water? What's been done to the air? What's been done to the land? When we try and perform these acts of individual responsibility, and then when we think about that, we realize that we need to go beyond that. We need to mobilize together on behalf of nature. And for me, that's the lesson: is finding a new pathway, a new doorway to approach these actions, and opening that, and knowing that it's like a scary place to go, but just taking that jump off the cliff and kind of going for it.
So a whole systemic change hinging upon asking the environment what it needs. That's a
we just really need to reconsider who's at the center of our, of our decisions, and that's most important right now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Joshua, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us from your mobile office and taking the time to speak to our audience on GLF Live. And to everyone who tuned in, thank you so much for listening once again. Please watch the Invisible Hand documentary if you have not already. It is so important, and it's such a joy to watch, and it will bring so much optimism about this movement and about what we can do to bring nature more power than it has in our current system. So once again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time on GLF Live.